Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. North Korea and China are signaling a new phase in their relationship. Following last month's summit, the two countries have exchanged a series of high-level visits to mark the 65th anniversary of their friendship treaty, highlighting closer strategic coordination. Now, at the same time, Kim Jong Un is tightening control at home with a rare public crackdown on military corruption, while concerns are also growing over North Korea's increasingly sophisticated cyber capabilities. So what do these latest developments tell us about Pyongyang's priorities and what they mean for South Korea and the broader security on the Korean Peninsula? For more on this, we are joined in the studio by Go Myung-hyun, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy. A very big welcome, Dr. Go.
Good to be with you.
And also joining us online is Brian Myers, Professor of Dongseul University's Minsa College of Liberal Arts. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So let's first begin our discussion with our Dr. Go. So like I've said, North Korea and China have stepped up high-level exchanges following the summit last month. What does this exchanges tell us about the current state of bilateral relations?
Well, it's really about the intensification of the bilateral relations that has started. I mean, in fact, it was started earlier this year, but then with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang's visit to Pyongyang. But then reached the pinnacle with President Xi's visit to North Korea in early June. But then the bilateral exchanges have intensified. And in fact, preceding Wang Huning's visit to North Korea, North Korean premier, in fact, went to Beijing to mark the anniversary of the friendship treaty. But having said that, I think the symbolism matters here. So you have to take into consideration the fact that Wang Huning is the number 4 in the power ranking in the Chinese Politburo. So he's one of the most important member of the standing committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, his portfolio is about ideological education as well as a liaison with other important fellow communist parties around the world. So his visit to North Korea, in fact, shows that China is making sure that this relationship is not, at least put the facade that it's not about a transactional relationship or one-time relationship improvement, but in fact, this is a reaffirmation of the long-standing party-to-party relations. So this is about the deepening the relations and sends a very strong signals to countries in the region, especially to South Korea, Japan, and the United States, that China is again calling the shots when it comes to bilateral relations, and that the North Korea and China, they see eye to eye. So therefore, South Korea and Japan and the United States cannot really drive a wedge between Beijing and Pyongyang. And that has huge implications for the South Korea's policy towards North Korea. And one of the main objectives of the South Korea policy about North Korea, besides engaging North Korea, is about denuclearization. So I think, so if China is getting close to North Korea, which is really about not just about strategic affinity, but also about deepening bilateral relations. That by implication means that China is more accepting of North Korea's nuclear capability. So this spells not a very positive news for South Korea's objective of denuclearization of North Korea.
But still quite a development in terms of bilateral ties. So if we build on that, Professor Myers, beyond the 65th anniversary of Friendship Treaty, why is North Korea then putting so much emphasis on its ties with China, particularly right now?
Well, I think it's an appropriate amount of emphasis when you take into account just how important China has been for North Korea throughout its history. And we tend to forget that, I think, because Kim's partnership with Putin, with Russia, has been getting so much more attention over the past year or so. Now, don't get me wrong, that relationship is important too. It's been very lucrative for Pyongyang, but there's no telling how long it will continue. And in any case, China remains North Korea's largest trading partner by far. So I'm sure that if Kim had to choose between China and Russia, he would choose China. But fortunately for him, he doesn't have to choose. He can maintain good relations with both neighbors. Now, I agree with Dr. Go that there is significance in Wang Huning visiting Pyongyang in as much as he's the expert on ideology and doctrine. So I agree that it signals that the relationship between China and North Korea is more than a transactional one. It's an ideological or values-based one. It's a close relationship between the CCP and the Workers' Party, whereas the relationship with Russia is clearly one of two states.
So if you mean by a values-based relationship, do you think these kinds of exchanges are seen as a one-off diplomatic push or the start of a longer shift in North Korea-China relations?
I don't see much of a shift here at all because the relationship has been solid for almost 10 years now. You know, if there was a shift, I would say it was China shifting away from cooperating with the West in regard to North Korea's nuclear program, because 2017 was the last time that China joined America in condemning that program. So the relationship has been good between the two countries, and I expect it to get stronger, not least because the Lee government here in South Korea is behaving more like the previous Yoon government than anybody expected. As you know, in Ankara, a little over a week ago, President Lee pledged that South Korea would advance with NATO and develop weapons with NATO for the cause of freedom and democracy. So the fronts are hardening in this new Cold War on the basis of different values. And if South Korea is pledging tight cooperation with NATO and IP4, we can hardly be surprised if North Korea and China tighten their relationship on ideological grounds, as I think this visit by Wang Huning signifies. So the only change I would expect in the Beijing-Pyongyang relationship is even closer cooperation.
Right. So the deepening ties between the two. Dr. Go, you've mentioned it's not really a good news for South Korea a while ago. Could you elaborate for us? What does this deepening relationship mean for South Korea and the security on the peninsula?
So I think China has also developed some sort of alliance envy. I think China has always been more pragmatic and flexible when it came to alliance relationship with neighbors. So for instance, we tend to apply we meaning like South Korea and other allies of the United States, such as Japan. Their vantage point is that the alliance that China has with North Korea should be similar to the alliance that South Korea and Japan have with the United States, but that's not true at all. In fact, the China-North Korean relationship has for a long time, especially after the Cold War, with the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, with the Soviet Union and so forth, has been pretty transactional and pragmatic on both sides. But then what the movements that we are seeing right now is, in fact, the restoration of the Cold War-based alliance, where, as Professor Myers mentioned, it's more value-based. But on the other hand, though, China has a dilemma when it comes to putting all their eggs in one basket, which is North Korea here. So China, even though China ideologically finds affinity with North Korea, we have to understand that China's trade volume with South Korea is like 4 to 5 orders of magnitude larger than the one that they have in North Korea. So, in fact, it's not even comparable. In fact, so the trade that China has with North Korea is, in fact, a marginal error if you compare it to the trade that China has with South Korea. So China has a dilemma that it's relying on South Korea for trade, but it's relying on North Korea for ideological affinity. So, in that sense, I think even though this so-called promotional bloc between Beijing and Moscow and Pyongyang looks very threatening. It's like this is an alliance information and so forth. But on the other hand, this is an alliance for the rainy days for China, I believe. For the most sunny days, when China wants to have good relations with neighbors, they have to look towards Seoul first rather than Pyongyang. So this is, in fact, so we shouldn't, this is a very worrisome development. At the same time, we shouldn't exaggerate the impact of this budding relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang, because at the end of the day, China's relationship with North Korea cannot live up to the alliance that Seoul has with the United States and the cooperation we have with Japan today.
A very important point in terms of the security in the peninsula. Now, if we turn to South Korea-China ties now, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is expected to visit Seoul next month. Professor Myers, what do you think we should be watching for over the visit?
Well, I expect that the Chinese are somewhat disappointed by the Lee administration. Now, of course, President Lee was never as pro-China as the South Korean right wing tried to frame him as being before the presidential elections. He's famous for having said South Korea should say xie xie to China, but in fact, he added, it should also say thank you to Taiwan. But nevertheless, I think Beijing was expecting somebody who would rule more in the tradition of President Moon Jae-in, who was, of course, very deferential to China and tried to preserve as much of a balance as possible between South Korea's security partnership with America and its trade relations with China. Instead, President Lee has really kind of extended the Yoon Suk-yeol tradition of foreign policy. He supports military cooperation with Japan and with the IP4. And as I just said, he wants South Korea to tighten its relationship with NATO. Now, don't forget the U.S. military commander here has publicly likened South Korea to a dagger or an aircraft carrier pointed at China. And those remarks really angered Beijing, but President Lee did not really distance his administration from them very clearly. And these are things that China cannot be happy about. And we all know that Foreign Minister Wang Yi is never afraid to speak bluntly. Of course, as Dr. Go said, the trade relationship is important to China too, and it needs South Korean semiconductors. So we're not going to see another Chinese boycott like we did 10 years ago. But I would expect Wang Yi to issue in some form or another an expression of displeasure and a warning that China is not going to maintain great trade relations with a South Korea that appears willing to join a hostile camp in this new Cold War that's developing.
Thank you for that opinion. So we'll have to look closely into the words coming out of the latest visit. Now, if you stay with China, Dr. Go, Beijing has recently stopped publicly emphasizing North Korea's denuclearization. How would you read into that?
Well, I think the issue of North Korea's denuclearization, or at least aggravating North Korea when it comes to North Korea's claim that its nuclear capability is irrevocable or irreversible, has become a bilateral prerequisite with North Korea. So any country that wants to establish or in fact improve relations with North Korea has to accept the North Korean proposition that North Korea should be recognized or accepted as a de facto nuclear state. And I think that's exactly what China has done to improve its relations with Pyongyang. So, for instance, China has omitted the mention of denuclearization from the recent denuclearization non-proliferation white paper that published earlier this year, and also as in the readouts of the Xi Jinping Kim Jong Un summit, and when President Xi visited North Korea in early June, they omitted the term denuclearization. So clearly, China has accepted the North Korean bilateral request to recognize North Korea, or at least be tacitly accepting of North Korea's nuclear capability. So I think this has a huge implication, clearly. So again, as I said earlier, South Korea's policies towards North Korea of engaging the Pyongyang can no longer rely on a honest brokering by Beijing. So if China had seen eye to eye with the rest of the international community about the impossibility of accepting North Korea's nuclear capability, that's no longer true. So I think China, if South Korea, for instance, reaches out to Beijing for mediation, for brokering, for communication with Pyongyang, I think China is going to reflecting more of the North Korean prerequisite for bilateral relations, which is recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state, or at very least abandon the policy or goal of North Korea's denuclearization. So I think this means that in the medium to long term, South Korea will have to come to acknowledgement that this is a new challenge for its foreign policy, not just towards North Korea, but also towards China. And this actually calls for a major revision of, or like at least reassessment of posture towards North Korea's denuclearization. So at the end of the day, I think engaging North Korea cannot be compatible with North Korea's denuclearization. And it's something that we have to think about very carefully now.
Right, a very important point. Now, if we shift gears a little bit, in North Korea, within North Korea, Kim Jong Un has also been tightening control, recently making a rare public example of a major military corruption case. Why do you think he chose to do that, Professor Myers?
Well, I think it was a rational thing to do. North Korea is a military-first country, as everybody up there knows. The top military officials make up the country's elite, and the priority given to the military causes a certain public resentment there. In fact, there's always been friction in North Korea between the military and civilian worlds. And naturally, military corruption is an issue of top importance because so much money is involved. So by making a public example of this high-profile case, which appears to be a very serious one indeed, Kim Jong Un is sending a strong signal to the entire elite to clean up their act. And he's also showing his concern for average soldiers, who are usually the first people to suffer when their generals and top officials are corrupt. So Kim is showing the public that he's looking out for it, and that's bound to have a positive effect on morale inside the military and on the entire public's opinion of him. But perhaps this was also to some extent influenced by Xi Jinping's investigations of China's top brass and the purges of some of its members. All of that resulted in a tighter hold for Xi Jinping over the Chinese military, and Kim may well be hoping for a similar effect in North Korea.
So if you look beyond the domestic politics, come September, the UN General Assembly is set to discuss North Korea's human rights record again. Do you think international pressure like this have any real impact on the regime right now?
I don't think so. I mean, the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry that came out 12 years ago in 2014 is said to have resulted in some improvements in North Korea, like the closure of the worst camps, slightly better treatment in ordinary prisons. But Kim was new to power then, and he had some hopes for better relations with the United States. But since then, I think his attitude has changed a lot, and he seems to have reverted to North Korea's traditional view that human rights criticism is just a big scam aimed at undermining North Korea's domestic security. And let's face it, the West has much less moral authority now than it did then. There's been a dramatic increase in censorship and surveillance across the Western world. And I think most people no longer consider North Korea to be the world's worst human rights offender. Besides, I don't think much pressure will even be attempted. For some reason, the West wants to go easy on North Korea. For example, Russia cannot participate in the Olympics, but North Korea can, although it has a worse human rights record, and it's also fighting Ukraine. So I don't expect much pressure, and in any case, North Korea will probably not yield to it.
But Professor Myers, you've mentioned, just a quick question, you've mentioned the West seems to be kind of more easing on North Korea. Why do you think that is the case?
I believe that the West is still hoping to kind of peel North Korea away from China and Russia. It's still hoping for a better relationship. And this could have something to do with Donald Trump's personal hopes. I think he is still hoping to achieve another summit with Kim Jong Un before he leaves office.
All right. Thank you for that opinion. Now, before we conclude our discussion, Dr. Go, let's turn to another growing concern, because reports suggest North Korea is using AI to strengthen its cyber attacks. How serious is the current situation?
So I think it's really less about intensity, it's more about the breadth of the wider vulnerability of the international community to North Korea's cyber attacks. So what I mean by this is North Korean cyber attacks have always been very serious threats, but then the magnitude of attacks have been limited by the major North Korean capacity bottleneck, which is the number of North Korean hackers that are proficient and well trained to go after the Western or targets that are in the international community. North Korea is a very closed society. It's not a rich guy society, so there's a clear limit to how many hackers, quote unquote, they could train at a given moment. But now with the agentic AI, the access to AI probably coming from China, what it means is that they can essentially double or triple or essentially multiply the threats, because these agent AI-based AIs, they can act as virtual hackers for North Korea. So instead of having 100 North Korean hackers, human hackers, going after different targets around the world, this means that North Korea can essentially outsource the hacking activities to AIs that they are in control of. So in that sense, it means that more targets will be vulnerable around the world. But doesn't mean that North Korea will acquire more intense hacking capabilities, say, for instance, by going after much more hardened targets, say like the defense firms or government agencies in the developed countries, because North Korea's access to AI is probably limited by the fact that the frontier AI models are in fact developed and owned by the United States. So even China is catching up to it. So I think that this gap in development in AI actually gives a little bit of respite to the vulnerable societies and targets around the world. But I think the remedy that we have to implement right now is essentially implement very fast AI-based defense systems so that we can confront the increasing volume of attacks by North Korea that we have to expect and will happen for sure in the near future.
Right. So it's really, I've seen a lot of news regarding that. It's really growing. How concerned are you personally about this?
So I think we should be very concerned. It means that the bar for personalizing cyber attacks against any ordinary citizen has gone down a great deal. What AI does is essentially commoditizing skills. So if hacking is a form of skill, it used to be very expensive. So North Korea hackers, for instance, had to reserve their hacking skills on very valuable targets. But now, if they can commoditize this skill set, that means that they can lower the target level of targets, so they can go after ordinary citizens because the cost, the marginal cost of going after another target is much lower now. So I think that means that not just the high-value targets, how important VIPs, so the famous people, individuals, and who have access to or have influence in the society that should be worried about North Korean hacking. It could be any one of us now.
Right, so it's a very concerning situation. It seems to raise the stakes a lot about this. But I'm afraid we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Go.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And of course, Professor Myers as well. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure too.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.